I'm going to move on to the next portion of the lecture, and we're going to talk about the four components of fashion and the fashion life cycle. So there are actually three graphs that we're going to be looking at that make up the fashion life cycle, and we're going to be looking at four components. Now, this section is particularly important because your discussion board is going to be based on these two topics. So it'll be based on silhouette, and it also will be based on one of the graphs that we're going to be looking at for the fashion life cycle. What makes up, what makes up fashion, right? So we've talked about fashion and style and design. We've talked about classics, trends, and fads, and there are three components that make up all of those garments, all of those that contribute to that terminology. So we're going to continue with some definitions here and look at some descriptors. Okay, so the components of fashion, the combination of elements that work together to create fashion are silhouette and details, color, and texture. So first, let's just talk about silhouettes. And your critical thinking, your discussion board for this week, actually, you will have seen this image again, is actually on silhouettes. Okay, so a silhouette is just the overall outline of a garment, right? So if we look at the different silhouettes that are here, A is what's known as a bell shape, or B is a bustle, so there's some back fullness. C is called straight or tubular, so it's some variation. There can be some variations of the straight silhouette because C doesn't really look straight. It's kind of like two cylinders on top of each other, so almost like two triangles. And all of the rest are just a variation of C, right? So we also have a slim fit, we have a rectangle, so a really square shape. We have a wedge because it's taller at the top and smaller at the bottom. And then conversely, we have the A-line, which is smaller at the top and bigger at the bottom. Did I say that? I may have said the other one backwards. F is bigger at the top and smaller at the bottom. G is smaller at the top, bigger at the bottom, A-line garment. And now everything we see here is a dress or a skirted item, but there are these same silhouettes, happen in pants, right? So a wide leg pant or a slim leg pant, a straight leg pant, a bell bottom pant. They're all versions of a silhouette. And silhouette is really important because good design are based on these simple constructions. In addition to silhouette, there are three more components that make up fashion. That's going to contribute to the style and design of a garment that could influence whether it's a classic, a fad, or a trend. And those three things are details, texture, and color. So first, let's talk about details. And details are just the trimmings and the length, the width, the shoulder, the waist, the sleeve treatment. So if we look at this garment, the garment on the left, some of the details are it's belted, it has a puffy sleeve, it's trimmed in fur, some of those are some of the details things. And then texture, right? Texture is the look and feel of the garment. Now, I can't touch this garment, but it looks luxurious, right? It looks like it's soft and warm. It looks like it would be like if you touched it, it would be calming. Like I'd say, like you want to pet it, right? Like an animal, that it would be calming. And texture does have an effect on the appearance and the silhouette of a garment. I mean, if we really look at this garment is probably either a rectangle, so a straight shape. It may be a little bit of an A-line, but the silhouette can be affected by the textures that you use in the garment, right? And then color, right? So historically, color has been a tricky one, right? And white, especially if we're looking at this picture, white has been a tricky one because it's hard to keep clean. So, historically, you had to be able to care for something that was white, but color is always a major consideration in clothing. And it used to be. I think we're moving away from the trend of there are masculine colors and there are feminine colors, right? So, for a good piece of recorded contemporary history, we only wore black when we were in mourning, right? And if you ever visited or lived in New York City, black is it's a color, it's a print. I mean, black is everything, right? And many of us, me included, have a lot of black in our closet. I have a lot of red too. That's my signature color, right? But color is really important, and color can symbolize. It can symbolize a lot of things. It can symbolize, kind of geographic location and again status. A fashion designer's palette changes with consumer preferences, and it also changes according to the seasons, right? Even though there are some colors that are seasonless, right? So white, black, khaki. Actually, white had a point where it wasn't seasonless, that you only wore white up until Labor Day. It was a small window where you were white, but there are colors that really are seasonless, and there is an entire career in fashion of just doing color forecasting, trend forecasting too. We'll talk about those two later, but just doing color forecasting and making determinations of what the next, you can't see my air quotes, in color, right, is going to be. Now that we have our terminology down, so we can explain, style, fashion, design, we can explain classic, fad, trend, we can explain silhouette, details, texture, and color. We're going to talk about the stages of the fashion cycle, and we're going to look at three different graphs over the next couple of slides that are different versions of the same, of much of the same information, but they do all denote different things, right? And one of the things that we need to know about fashion cycles is they don't just happen. There are definite stages in a cycle. Things are called cycles for a reason. It's because they happen over and over again in predictable ways. So if we were in, economics class, we would be talking about economic cycles, right? In a business class, we would be talking about business cycles. So fashion isn't any different than the other cycles. And like I said, this first graph we're gonna look at is the basic life cycle of fashion that can be represented in, this is called a bell-shaped curve because it just curves up, right? So what we're going to talk about in this first graph is we're going to look at the way that we as consumers, yeah, I mean not as consumers, we as businesses look at the fashion cycle. So how do things start? Okay, so the first thing that happens in any cycle is that it is introduced. An item or garment is introduced. So it's new to the market. It's something that nobody has ever seen before. So it starts in an introduction phase. And, it could be a new style or color or texture. It may be, a design choice that is different. And in all honesty, most new styles are introduced at higher price, a higher price point and higher price merchandise, and then it moves along the cycle to us as regular consumers. I'm sorry, I said introduction stage. It also is known as the innovation stage, right, for the higher end garments. And then it moves on to the next stage, which is, mass acceptance, right? That culmination when, everybody wants it. It's something that oftentimes this is where things that are trends become classics, and it just settles into pretty uniform sales patterns, right? So when we talked about athleisure a little bit earlier. Athleisure is one of the things that was in the innovation stage, which had risen with a handful of high-end vendors. If we look at even though they existed at lower price points, if we look at the Lululemons of the world, um, and now it's mass. It's generally accepted that you can wear athleisure almost everywhere, right? And then the third stage is when it's on the decline, when things start to become obsolete, and they're just things that people don't want anymore. And how long something either stays in the innovation stage and moves to the decline stage varies. And often that's what determines whether something is a fad, a trend, or a classic, right? So if we look at the bottom part of this bell curve, things in the decline stages, classics, I don't say they never get there, but they're not there, right? So that's why the Chanel boucle jacket is still, it's still in the mass acceptance, and Levi jeans is still in the mass acceptance. It hasn't, traditionally, it hasn't moved to the decline stage. So us as consumers, we play a key factor in these stages, right? So if you look at the graph this time, you'll see two lines at the bottom. You'll see the blue line represents the consumer use cycle, so how long an item may be out in the market, right? From innovation to decline. And then you see represented by the red, the consumer buying cycle. And sometimes, when things get to the decline stage, they fall off very quickly from us wanting to buy them. However, the use cycle is a little bit longer. So the use cycle, we have them in our closet. They're already on order with the retailer, with the vendor, so they still are you can't see my air quotes, in the use category. But there are, two curves, and they have a direct relation to one another. And the sweet spot is where the two curves meet, right? That's where retailers want to be. They want to be in the spot where consumers want it and they have it, right? They hate that chasm between the consumer buying cycle and the consumer use cycle. They want to make sure um, that if they have it, that it's something that we still want, right? So, in fashion, there just are ups and downs and stops and starts, and the normal flow of fashion is in a cycle. That's why we're gonna look at one more. We're gonna look at one more graph on the next slide. It is in cycles, and really, it's unpredictable, right? There are the cycles, even though we know that they're going to be innovation, culmination, decline, right? So introduction, mass acceptance, and when people don't want it anymore, that obsolescence, it's not predictable. It's not predictable to retailers, and that is the part that is really rough, right? So again, if we look at where we are look at where our economy is because of COVID, this widespread mass, job loss has affected the consumer buying cycle, right? So we literally had months, well, we still are, we had months of quarantine, we had months of stores not even being able to be open, and they had things in their cycle, right, already ready for us to buy, and then our buying cycle changed, right? So I was fortunate enough that I wasn't unemployed, but what I bought changed since I wasn't going out. I didn't buy lashes. I had to buy lashes for like 2 months because I had a stash, right? I definitely moved towards buying more athleisure or relaxing, at home, and you can't see my air quotes, at home type clothing than, things that I would normally be wearing for to have my lectures with you guys face to face in class. So there are breaks in the cycle, and it is unpredictable because fashion is tied to our, like we talked about in that at the beginning, it's tied to our economic, our political, it's tied to what's happening in society. Last graph of the fashion cycle, and this one is different because this graph, the other ones did too, but this graph specifically shows, sales across time. And it, again, it looks at items that are fad. So you see that bell curve on a fad, it peaks really quickly and then it drops off, right? And then, if you look at a seasonal staple, so something that is purchased based on the season, so, swimsuits or flip-flops or winter coats or, wool sweaters, right? They have this kind of curvy line, right? And then we see the thing that's a flop, right? In merchandise and retail buying, we call it a dog, right? It was horrible. It was a dog. It came in, we need to get rid of it, right? So a flop, right? So, you know, and it's not on this. There's not a graph for it, but if we were to look at a classic, a classic would have kind of just like a straight line across time. So, right? So if we use Levi, if we were to use Levi as an example, Levi would have a pretty stable straight line across time. They may have some minor dips in sales, but they would have a pretty stable line. But the other stage is how things fluctuate across time. And your discussion board this week, you're going to be looking at silhouette and this graph for fashion cycle and how things fluctuate across time. And again, if we look at these graphs, right, some of these fashions, have long and short runs. So obviously, a fad is going to have what's known as a short run, where it just doesn't take a lot of time for people to grasp onto the thing, use it, and then be done with it forever. And then, some long run fashions take more seasons to complete. So again, I'm going to use athleisure. Athleisure started low, it got to a high point, and then it's been kind of up and down since. It's more up now again because COVID has us at home. It's more up now. So again, so there are three major stages of the fashion cycle, right? So one is just the fashion cycle as a whole. We talked about that 2 slides ago. Next is, fashion cycles, buying and uses for consumers. And then last, the fluctuating styles of different types of fashion items. In this portion of the lecture, we've covered a handful, we've covered the majority of what we're going to talk about, this week, right? So we've talked about just the nature of fashion. We've talked a little bit about some of the misconceptions. You have some key terminology that you should know. I'm not going to list them all again, but there's at least 9 key terms that you should know by now. We have talked about the fashion cycle, several versions of the fashion cycle, and in the rest of the lecture, so the next part of the lecture, we're going to talk about a couple of other really important things, right? So what we're going to talk about in the last pieces of the lecture, so on these other tabs that you're going to look at, we're going to talk about some of the intangibles of fashion and a couple of the principles. And last but not least, we will talk about a couple of jobs that you can get in the fashion industry that are directly related to these components that we talked about in the lecture, in the first parts of the lecture. We're going to talk about marketing and we're going to talk about fashion merchandising. And I'm going to give you some specific details on what it would entail to have a job doing one of those two things. So go ahead and click on the next tab of the lecture.